Hey, what's up guys? I'm Austin and welcome to Fantasy LCS Week 4 Preview. Let's jump right in by looking at some trade options. Starting off with the fan favorite, FlyQuest. Now FlyQuest I think have exceeded all of our expectations. They're sitting pretty second in the table. High and Moon are the second and third highest scoring players in the first two games format. That's very impressive. They will face Phoenix 1 and Cloud9 this weekend. And I want to state real quick that I am a pretty big traditional sports fan. In fact, I'm coming off quite the high this weekend as a Patriots fan. And I think that when athletes face their former team, they play with a little bit of extra swagger. They play with that extra motivation. And I think that'll be the case this weekend with guys like High, Balls, and Lemon. Even Alltech for a while was in that C9 organization. I think they'll come out swinging. I think they'll play very hard. I think they'll at least take a game off Cloud9, which I know is very impressive considering that Cloud9 is the only remaining undefeated team in North America. But I do think FlyQuest is a good fantasy option. Now, G2 and H2K will each play two matchups this weekend, and that's very exciting from a fantasy perspective, not just for players in an 8-man league, but for players in really every league, because there's such talent on those two rosters. And in splits past, these would be guys that are in your starting lineup every week. Now, looking at it from a team perspective and a non-fantasy perspective real quick, I think G2 is the better team. I think they will take that series. I think it'll be close, but they are playing a little bit better right now, I think. And so if you want a team to go with, if you want a team that's going to put up more points, I think G2 will be that team. They have put up a great amount of points every week in fantasy. I think in a best game format, when they play one game, or one series, they put up an average of 22. When they play two matchups, they put up an average of 44 points. But I think if you look at this match from an individual perspective, an individual player perspective, H2K players will outshine G2. I think Yankos, Odoamne, and Febvin are big fantasy factors. I think they'll have a great weekend as far as fantasy goes. Perhaps a little bit more risky if you play first two games, because if G2 were to take one of those two, depending on how bloody the game was, it may result in lower points for those guys. But I think in a best game format, you have a very good shot at H2K taking a game from G2 and therefore putting up a really good amount of points. Now they do face each other on Thursday. That's why I'm talking about this. They of course will each play another match. They should each win their second match. They're against weaker opponents. I believe Rock had an Origin. So those are definite pickups, especially if you're in an 8-man league. Now looking ahead at week 5 real quick, I want to take a look at Splice and Fnatic. Now, something that's been happening in my leagues is players are really jumping on grabbing these EU guys that play two matchups the next week once the roster's unlocked for the current week, which I believe takes place Saturday. And so I want to get you guys the extra advantage as well. Now, just like G2 and H2K, Splice and Fnatic will also play each other next week. Now, Fnatic has undergone some roster changes recently. Just this week, they have substituted out Amazing for a new jungler, and they didn't fare so well last week. They lost their first matchup, and so therefore I think Splice is the definite safer option heading into week 5. I think you should do your best to pick up guys like Kobe and Senkux, the real center point of that Splice roster. Very talented, a great fantasy option. Fnatic is not a terrible fantasy option. I think Reckless is always someone who can contend for a starting spot, but I would focus on Splice for week 5. Now it's time for the week 4 edition of Hot or Not. Let's begin with someone who is not hot, and that is Team Dignitas. Now, Dignitas, not only did they fail to pick up a series win in week 3, but they failed to pick up a single game win in week 3. I think that's very concerning, especially considering the amount of talent on that roster. This week they will face Immortals and Envy, so they could potentially put up points, but they are very inconsistent and not a team that you want to rely on. I don't think that they'll have a terrible weekend. If you need to start Dignitas players for whatever reason, maybe like someday, a lot of you might rely on him as your top laner. Perhaps Chaser and Keen, probably more so Chaser. I don't think they would be terrible options, especially considering how bad Immortals and Envy have been as well. It's just not a team that you want to rely on for fantasy points. Now, Cloud9 on the opposite end of the spectrum are hot. They have yet to drop a game this season. Jensen is the highest overall scoring player in the first 2-game format. Contracts is the second or third highest scoring jungler depending on how you play. And Smoothie is the second highest scoring support. They're the highest scoring team overall. They have everything going. I did mention they're playing FlyQuest this weekend. That could, in my opinion, go either way. I do think Cloud9 will take that series, although I do think FlyQuest will play very well. But Cloud9 overall is a team that's very hot. I'm not sure why you would even considering benching any player right now for Cloud9. I know I have seen some questions on Reddit and so forth about whether or not Contract should be in there. I do think Contract should be your starting jungler. Definitely. I mean, depending on what format you play, like I just mentioned, he's either second or third overall, the high scoring jungler. I think he needs to be in your lineups. I think everyone from Cloud9 needs to be in your starting roster if you own them. Finally, in this category, Cody Sun. Now, Cody Sun is probably someone that a decent number of you guys drafted thinking that he would be your starting ADC, maybe your flex, and it probably hasn't worked out so well. He's one of only 2 North American ADs to have less than 2 games with 10 plus kills or assists, and he has the 3rd lowest kills of any North American AD. I don't think this is all his fault. I think Immortals is very shaky right now. They haven't really been impressive fantasy-wise or just LCS-wise. But Cody Sun is a player that is not hot right now. I think that's very unfortunate for a lot of you guys who may have drafted him thinking that he would be a reliable option because Immortals had some real talent on their roster this split. Now get cozy because it's time for Week 4 sleepers. Now I know I just bagged on Immortals, but they do face a very favorable schedule for Week 4. They'll take on Dignitas, who I also just trashed on for a couple minutes, and Team Liquid. Now, Team Liquid, of course, actually very similar to Immortals in that they have a very talented roster, but are definitely under exceeding expectations. So you never really know how they're going to play, and I think that's very concerning. Dignitas, of course, mentioned it earlier, not the best, especially last week. So Immortals does have a great chance to rebound this weekend. I'm not saying you go full force with Immortals. I would definitely sit guys like Flame, who've been underwhelming. Cody Sun, I would not be ready to put in yet. But perhaps Pobelter or Dardoch, I think those 2 guys are potentially ready for a breakout Week 4. So keep an eye on them. Now, CLG are also a little disappointing. They're sitting 5th in the table with only 2 wins, but I think that's a little misleading. They played very well against TSM last week and defeated Dignitas. This week they'll take on Echo Fox and P1. Both of those series should be pretty close. Echo Fox is talented. P1 is talented. I think it will be great for fantasy. I think they're all around the same competitive level. Talent-wise, gameplay-wise, I think that'll be good for fantasy. You probably already are starting Stixay. He's been pretty good despite CLG's troubles through the first 3 weeks. So maybe look at guys like Darshan and Afro as 2 players who might be able to step up into a little bit of a bigger role this weekend and put up some bigger fantasy numbers. Let's quickly revisit last week and review my advice. So overall, I think I was pretty accurate. The good, would be Splice, Froggen, Altec, and I did in the mailbox segment recommend Lorlo over Zig, and no matter what format you played, whether it was first 2 games or best game, Lorlo did put up a little bit more points than Zig. Now the bad, just like the week before, was my sleeper picks. I know I've been slacking on those sleeper picks, guys. I apologize this week. I think I'll turn that around with Immortals and CLG. But last week I recommended Team Liquid and Keith. Now Liquid, I was very bummed out about. I'm sure a lot of you guys were too. They had everything going for that schedule. It was supposed to be a big breakout week. They were really disappointing. Liquid players did not play terrible as far as fantasy points go because they had a nice rebound for their final series, but it definitely could have been a lot more points. And Keith, I think Echo Fox overall struggled a little bit last week. Keith only put up 30-something points in a best game format, I believe, so I'm sorry for that pick. I also thought he would do a little bit better. And now we conclude this episode with another edition of Mailbox Questions. So our first question is Nuclear or Stixxay? I would go for Stixxay. I did mention H2K earlier. I thought they'd have a great week in fantasy. Nuclear is still relatively new to the LCS stage. It's a very big game this week against G2, probably the biggest yet. Stixxay has an easier schedule. Plus, he has been very reliable in weeks 1 through 3, putting up very respectable numbers despite CLG's woes. I think most of H2K's points will come from Feblevin, Yankos, and Odo, and that's why I'm hesitant to rely on Nuclear over Stixxay for either my AD or flex. Now, I will say Nuclear does present a very good flex option if you already have someone in that AD spot who's solid. That's definitely something you should consider. Now, is Froggen a safe long-term option? I feel very confident in saying yes. He has the second highest overall points in a best game format and 7th overall in the first 2 games format. Echo Fox, despite their really inconsistencies, I believe first week was 0-2, second week was 2-0, last week I believe was 0-2. Froggen has been consistently putting points up on the board, so I think his ability to do that, despite whatever Echo Fox is going through that particular week, is probably the best news that really a fantasy LCS player could hope for, to have someone who is on not the best team, who you could snag either late in the draft or as a free agent pickup, who is of starter quality. So yes, I do think Froggen is a safe long-term option. Remember to send your questions via the comment section of this video or in the Reddit thread containing this episode, and I'll do my best to answer each one. Remember to like and subscribe for more Fantasy LCS content. Thanks for watching, guys. Good luck in week 4, and see you back here again next week.